The year was 2387, and humanity had learned the hard way that the universe was not kind to the weak. Across the sprawling expanse of the Terran Colonial Defense Academy on Proxima Station, the morning light cast long shadows through reinforced transparent steel windows. Here, in the cold vacuum of space orbiting humanity's newest frontier world, the future defenders of the human race prepared for a war that had already begun in whispers and diplomatic threats. Cadet Lieutenant Jake Morrison stood at attention in Formation Hall Delta 7, his uniform crisp despite the 18-hour training cycle he'd just endured. Around him, 49 other human cadets maintained perfect military bearing, their faces carved from stone and determination. They were the best of the best children of Earth's colonies, bred on worlds where the gravity crushed ordinary men and the atmosphere could kill with a single breath. Morrison himself hailed from Caridian Prime, a death world where the gravity ran at 2.3 times Earth standard and the indigenous predators could tear through titanium plating. His bones were dense as steel, his reflexes honed by a childhood spent outrunning creatures that had evolved to hunt in conditions that would flatten most species. He didn't know it yet, but those very adaptations would soon change the course of an interstellar conflict. "Cadets," announced Admiral Victoria Cross, her voice carrying the weight of authority earned through 3 decades of frontier warfare. "Today marks a new chapter in human military evolution. For the first time in our species' history, we will be training alongside allies in the Galactic Defense Consortium." The word allies hung in the air like a question mark. Everyone in that room knew the truth. The consortium had approached humanity not out of friendship but out of necessity. The Devourers, an ancient machine intelligence, had begun their expansion into this sector of the galaxy. Humanity's worlds lay directly in their path, and the consortium needed every warm body they could get. What the consortium hadn't anticipated was just how warm and dangerous human bodies could be. The massive blast doors at the rear of the hall hissed open with mechanical precision, and the alien delegation entered with the fluid grace of beings accustomed to lighter gravity. Leading them was Commander Zidlthik of the Hegemony, a towering figure whose crystalline exoskeleton caught the light like fractured starlight. His 4 arms moved with deliberate precision, and his compound eyes, thousands of facets that could track multiple targets simultaneously, swept across the human cadets with obvious disdain. Behind him came a retinue of various species: the serpentine Veltar with their hypnotic movements, the insectoid Krithak, whose chitin armor gleamed like polished obsidian, and the ethereal Nixani, whose translucent forms seemed to phase in and out of visible light. Each species had contributed to the consortium's military might for millennia, and each looked upon the humans with the same expression, barely concealed contempt for primitives who had crawled out of their gravity well only centuries ago. Morrison felt something cold settle in his stomach. Utility. Not capability. Not partnership. Utility. Admiral Cross stepped forward, her jaw set in a line that Morrison had learned to associate with barely restrained fury. "Commander Zalthak, our cadets have undergone the most rigorous training protocols in human space. They are prepared to demonstrate their capabilities according to standard consortium evaluation procedures." "Standard procedures," Zalthak repeated, his mandibles clicking in what Morrison suspected was amusement. "Yes, let us see what your Death Worlders can accomplish." The way he said Death Worlders made it sound like a curse. For the next 3 hours, Morrison and his fellow cadets were put through a series of tests that would have broken soldiers from any other species. Combat simulations, tactical assessments, endurance trials, each designed not just to measure their abilities, but to push them past their breaking point. The alien observers watched with detached interest, occasionally making notes on devices that hummed with technologies humanity was still decades from understanding. It was during the close-quarters combat evaluation that everything changed. Morrison found himself paired against Velthani Sektar, a consortium instructor whose serpentine form moved with liquid grace. The alien's scales shimmered with defensive plating that could deflect energy weapons, and its 4-meter length coiled with muscles that could crush a grown human with ease. "This demonstration," Zalthak announced to the assembled observers, "will show the futility of close combat training for primitive species. Instructor Sector, you may begin." The Veltar moved like flowing water, its sinuous body weaving patterns that confused the eye and made targeting nearly impossible. Morrison dodged the first strike by millimeters, feeling alien scales whisper past his throat. He rolled, came up in a defensive crouch, and realized with growing dread that he was completely outmatched. The second strike caught him across the ribs, and Morrison felt something crack. The third wrapped around his left leg and began to squeeze with bone-crushing force. Through the haze of pain he heard Commander Zalthek's harmonic laughter echoing through the hall. As expected, the hegemony commander announced, impressive reflexes for a primitive, but ultimately, Morrison's world exploded into red fury. The word primitive ignited something primal in his mind, something that had been forged in the crushing gravity of his homeworld and tempered by a lifetime of fighting to survive. He grabbed the coiled alien muscle around his leg with both hands and twisted with every ounce of strength his dense bones could generate. The sound that filled the hall was unlike anything the alien observers had ever heard. It started as a wet snap, the sound of cartilage tearing and bone breaking under impossible pressure. It was followed by a shriek from Instructor Sector that registered in frequencies most species couldn't produce, a sound of pure agony that made several of the observers recoil in shock. Morrison had broken the Veltar's spine. The silence that followed was deafening. Instructor Sector lay motionless on the training mat, its serpentine form twisted at an unnatural angle. Morrison stood over it, breathing hard, his uniform torn and bloody, but his eyes burning with undiminished defiance. Commander Zedelfax stared at the scene with all 1,000 facets of his compound eyes, his crystalline form perfectly motionless. When he finally spoke, his harmonic voice had lost all trace of amusement. Impossible. Admiral Cross stepped forward, her voice carefully controlled. Commander, I believe this demonstrates that human— Silence! Zalthek's roar shattered the air like breaking crystal. In one fluid motion he launched himself across the 20-meter gap separating him from Morrison, his forearms extending claws that could slice through battle armor. Morrison barely had time to raise his hands before 2 tons of crystalline alien fury crashed into him. Zalthek's primary arm swept down in a strike that would have decapitated most beings, but Morrison twisted at the last second, taking the blow across his shoulder instead of his neck. The impact drove him to his knees, but he didn't fall. Through the explosion of pain he heard gasps from the human cadets and shocked harmonic cries from the alien observers. No one moved to intervene. This had escalated beyond a training exercise into something far more dangerous. Zalthek raised his arm for a killing blow, his compound eyes blazing with fury. You will learn your place, primitive. The strike came down with all the force of an orbital bombardment, and Morrison caught it. His hands closed around Zalthek's crystalline forearm with a grip that could crush steel. The alien commander's momentum carried him forward, but Morrison held firm, his feet planted like mountains on his homeworld. For a moment that stretched into eternity, they were locked in a tableau of impossible physics. 2 tons of alien fury held motionless by one human cadet who refused to break. Then Morrison twisted. The sound was like a glacier calving, like a mountain falling, like the death of stars. Silatik's arm, forged from crystalline structures that had evolved to withstand the pressure of gas giants, shattered like glass in Morrison's grip. Fragments of alien bones scattered across the training floor, each piece ringing like a funeral bell as it struck the deck. Commander Zalthek's scream shook the bulkheads. The hegemony commander staggered backward, clutching the jagged remnants of his shattered limb, his compound eyes wide with shock and something that might have been fear. Around the hall, alien observers stood in stunned silence, their various forms of breathing apparatus working overtime to process what they had just witnessed. A human cadet, barely out of adolescence by galactic standards, had broken the arm of one of the consortium's most decorated combat commanders. Morrison stood in the center of the chaos, his chest heaving, his hands still stained with alien blood. When he spoke, his voice carried across the silent hall with the weight of prophecy. We are not your primitives. We are not your cannon fodder. We are human. Zalthek's remaining 3 arms trembled with rage and pain as medics from his delegation rushed to tend his wounds. His harmonic voice, when he finally found it, was barely a whisper. This changes nothing. You are still primitives playing with weapons beyond your comprehension. The Devourers will consume your worlds, and when they do, remember this moment. Remember how your arrogance doomed your entire species. He turned to leave, his crystalline form moving with the careful gait of the severely wounded. At the threshold of the blast doors, he paused and looked back with eyes that promised retribution. The consortium will remember what happened here today, human, and we will not forget. The doors sealed behind the alien delegation with the finality of a tomb closing. In the sudden quiet, Morrison became aware of 49 pairs of human eyes staring at him with expressions ranging from awe to terror. He had just assaulted a consortium commander. He had shattered a military alliance that humanity desperately needed. And somehow, looking at the alien blood on his hands, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. Instead, they had discovered that Earth's children were something far more dangerous than allies. They were weapons. The emergency session of the Terran Colonial Council convened at 0400 hours, 36 minutes after Commander Zieltek's delegation had departed Proxima Station aboard their flagship Eternal Resonance. In the sterile confines of Conference Room Alpha, humanity's leaders gathered to discuss the implications of what some were already calling the Morrison Incident. Admiral Cross stood before a holographic display showing casualty reports, her weathered face grim in the blue light. Instructor sectors paralyzed from the point of spinal fracture downward. Commander Zaltek's primary arm has been completely severed. Their medical technology can regrow the limb, but it will take months. Secretary General Elena Vasquez leaned forward, her fingers steepled, and their response: radio silence for the past 6 hours. But their fleet is still holding position at the edge of the system. Cross manipulated the display, showing the positions of 17 consortium warships arranged in what could charitably be called a defensive formation, or less charitably, a blockade. Whatever they're planning, they're not leaving. In the detention bay 3 decks below, Cadet Lieutenant Jake Morrison sat on a narrow bunk, his hands cleaned of alien blood but still trembling with residual adrenaline. The holding cell was sparsely furnished, a necessity when housing someone whose bone density could punch through standard bulkheads. He stared at his reflection in the polished steel mirror, trying to process what he had done. The door chimed, and Admiral Cross entered with 2 guards. Her expression was unreadable as she settled into the chair across from him. "You've started a war, Morrison." He met her gaze steadily. "With respect, Admiral, I think the war started the moment they called us primitives." Cross was silent for a long moment, studying the young man who had single-handedly destabilized the most important military alliance in human history. "Tell me what you were thinking in that moment when Zalethek struck you." Morrison's jaw tightened. "I was thinking that I'd rather die standing than live on my knees. That's what we are to them, isn't it? Cannon fodder with delusions of grandeur. And is your pride worth the extinction of our species?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Morrison looked down at his hands that had crushed crystalline bone like glass, hands that might have doomed humanity to face the devourer threat alone. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I know that living as their slaves isn't living at all." Cross nodded slowly. "The Council is meeting now to decide your fate, and possibly ours." Meanwhile, aboard the Eternal Resonance, Commander Zalthek underwent reconstructive surgery in the ship's medical bay. The procedure was a marvel of biotechnology. New crystalline structures were being grown and grafted onto his shattered limb, each facet precisely calibrated to match his original anatomy. But the physical healing would be nothing compared to the psychological trauma. In his 3 centuries of military service, Zaltek had never been bested in single combat. He had led campaigns against the Void Runners of the Andromeda Spiral, had personally executed the hierarch of the Silicon Hegemony, had stood victorious on 100 battlefields across the galaxy. His reputation was built on unshakable confidence in hegemony's superiority. A human child had shattered that reputation along with his arm. "Commander," came the melodic voice of Subcommander Tilesh, his aide-de-camp. "The Consortium High Command has responded to your report." Zalthek flexed his newly grafted fingers, testing their strength. The limb was functional but would never be quite the same. A permanent reminder of human defiance. "Their orders? You are to return to Consortium space immediately for debriefing. The human alliance is to be reconsidered." Reconsidered. Zaltek tasted the word like poison. "They wish to abandon this sector to the devourers rather than acknowledge what we witnessed." Talish's translucent form shimmered with nervousness. "The humans caught us off guard, Commander. Their physical capabilities were grossly underestimated in the initial assessments." but they remain primitive in terms of technology and tactical doctrine. Zalthek turned to face his subordinate, his compound eyes reflecting the medical bay's harsh lighting. Primitive? That human cadet broke my arm with his bare hands. Tylash. He shattered crystalline bone that can withstand meteor impacts, and when I struck him with enough force to crater a building, he simply absorbed the blow and struck back. He moved to the observation port, gazing out at the blue-green world of Proxima's colony. No, they are not primitive. They are something else entirely. What are your orders, Commander? Zalthek was quiet for a long time, watching the distant lights of human settlements on the planet's surface. When he spoke, his voice carried a harmonic undertone that Tylash had learned to associate with dangerous decisions. Send a message to the human colony. Tell them I wish to speak with their Admiral Cross. And tell them I come not as a conqueror but as someone seeking to understand what manner of beings we have encountered. Back on Proxima Station, the council session had devolved into shouting matches and accusations. Some members demanded Morrison's immediate execution to appease the consortium. Others argued for a declaration of independence, claiming humanity could face the Devourer threat alone. A few pragmatists suggested a middle path, negotiations that might salvage some form of alliance while acknowledging the new balance of power. Admiral Cross received Zalthek's message in the midst of the chaos. The words were formal, diplomatic, but she caught something else in the phrasing. A note of genuine curiosity that hadn't been there during the initial evaluation. He wants to talk, she announced to the assembly. Commander Zalthek is requesting a private meeting. It's a trap, snapped Defense Minister Harrison. The moment you board his ship, they'll take you hostage. Maybe, Cross acknowledged, but it might also be our only chance to prevent this from escalating into a shooting war. Secretary General Vasquez leaned back in her chair. What does he want to discuss? Cross studied the message again, noting the unusual phrasing and tonal markers. He says he wants to understand what we are. Not who we are. What we are. 3 hours later, Admiral Cross found herself in the alien environment of the Eternal Resonance's conference chamber. The room was a marvel of crystalline architecture, with walls that seemed to grow organically from the floor and ceiling. The atmosphere was thick with gases that her breathing apparatus filtered, and the gravity was set to hegemony standard, roughly half of Earth normal. Commander Zalthek entered through a membrane door that sealed behind him like living tissue. His newly grafted arm moved with mechanical precision, and Cross noticed that he favored it slightly, a permanent reminder of their previous encounter. Admiral Cross, he said, his harmonic voice carefully modulated to avoid the aggressive overtones she had heard during the evaluation. Thank you for accepting my invitation. Commander, I trust your medical treatment was successful? Zalthek flexed his grafted fingers. Successful, yes. Though I suspect I will carry the memory of your cadet's strength for the remainder of my life. You wish to discuss what humans are, she said. Indeed, my species has been part of the Galactic Consortium for over 2 millennia. In that time, we have encountered thousands of sentient species across hundreds of worlds. Each has fit into established categories. The brilliant but fragile scholars, the resilient but slow builders, the swift but delicate scouts. His mandibles clicked thoughtfully. Humans do not fit any category. Cross nodded. We've noticed. Your homeworld's gravity is only slightly above galactic average. Yet your bone density rivals that of species evolved on supermassive worlds. Your reaction times are faster than species with specialized nervous systems. Your endurance exceeds that of creatures bred for long-distance travel. Zalthek leaned forward. Most puzzling of all, you seem to grow stronger under stress rather than weaker. Evolution is a harsh teacher, Commander. Earth didn't coddle us. No. But that alone doesn't explain what I witnessed. When I struck Cadet Morrison, he should have been incapacitated. Instead, he became more dangerous. His pupils dilated, his muscle tension increased, and his reflexes accelerated. It was as if combat triggered some form of biological enhancement. Cross smiled grimly. We call it adrenaline, fight or flight response. When humans are threatened, our bodies flood with chemicals that temporarily increase our physical capabilities. Temporarily? Zalthek's compound eyes widened. You mean Morrison was not operating at full capacity during our initial evaluation? Commander, That cadet had been awake for 18 hours and had undergone intensive training before your demonstration. He was probably operating at about 60% of his potential when you fought him. The silence that followed was profound. Zalthek stared at the human admiral as if seeing her for the first time, his crystalline form completely motionless. 60%, he repeated. Give or take. Humans are most dangerous when they're cornered, threatened, or protecting something they care about. Your attack triggered every survival instinct he possessed. Zalthek rose from his chair and moved to the chamber's observation port. Outside, the stars wheeled in their eternal dance, indifferent to the momentous conversation taking place in the tiny metal shell hanging in the void. The consortium came here expecting to find another client species beings we could use as auxiliary forces against the Devourer threat. Instead, we have discovered— He paused, searching for words. What have we discovered, Admiral? You've discovered that humanity doesn't need the consortium as much as the consortium needs humanity. The truth of it hung between them like a living thing. For centuries, the Galactic Consortium had maintained peace through a careful balance of power. Older, more technologically advanced species led and protected younger civilizations in exchange for resources and loyalty. It was a system that had worked for millennia, but humanity threatened to upset that balance. Here was a species barely 3 centuries removed from their homeworld, possessing technology that was primitive by galactic standards, yet capable of feats of individual combat that stunned veteran soldiers. They were an unknown variable in an equation that had been stable since before Earth's sun had formed. The High Command has ordered me to return to Consortium space, Zoltek said finally. The human alliance is to be discontinued, leaving us to face the Devourers alone. Yes, Cross nodded, having expected as much. And what will you tell them when you return? Zoltek turned from the observation port, his newly grafted arm catching the light. When he spoke, his harmonic voice carried undertones of something that might have been regret. I will tell them that humanity is unlike any species we have encountered, that your combat capabilities have been severely underestimated, and that abandoning this sector may be the gravest strategic error in consortium history. Will they listen? No. They are afraid of what your species represents. The possibility that biological evolution can surpass technological advancement. The consortium has grown comfortable with predictable allies and manageable threats. You are neither. Cross stood as well, moving to join him at the observation port. Together they gazed out at the vast starfield, each lost in thoughts of what was to come. Zalthek's mandibles clicked in what she was beginning to recognize as amusement. You are perceptive, Admiral, yes? There is something else. The Devourers are not simply expanding randomly into this sector. They are pursuing something. Specific target that our intelligence networks have been unable to identify. And you think it's here? In human space? I think the Devourers have been observing galactic communications for some time. They may have detected the same anomalies in human development that brought the consortium to your door. If so, they will not be deterred by our withdrawal. The implications hit Cross like a physical blow. They're coming for us specifically. It is possible. And if they are, your species will face them with primitive weapons and no allies. Zaltek's compound eyes fixed on her with unmistakable intensity. Unless, of course, certain individuals within the consortium were to act independently of official policy. Cross turned to face the alien commander fully. What are you suggesting? I am suggesting that Commander Zaltek of the Hegemony Third Fleet may find his return to consortium space delayed by mechanical difficulties. And during that delay he might take it upon himself to conduct extended observations of human combat doctrine. Observations that might include joint training exercises. Hypothetically. Yes. And if certain advanced technologies were to be accidentally left behind during these observations, Cross felt something cold and calculating settle in her chest. The same instinct that had led humanity from stone tools to starships in the space of 10,000 years. What would you want in return? Access to human medical and biological data. Your species' adaptation mechanisms could revolutionize consortium military doctrine, if properly understood. And when the Devourers arrive? Zalthek's harmonic voice dropped to a whisper. Then we will discover together whether human ferocity and consortium technology can forge an alliance capable of stopping the oldest enemy in the galaxy. As if summoned by their words, an alarm began to sound throughout the ship. Zaltak moved to a communication panel, his newly grafted fingers dancing across controls that pulsed with alien light. The voice that emerged from the speakers was mechanically translated but carried undertones of terror that needed no interpretation. It was the voice of a consortium scout ship captain, calling from the edge of the system. "This is reconnaissance vessel Far Seeker calling all consortium vessels. We have emerged from hyperspace to find. Static filled the channel, followed by sounds that made both Cross and Zalthek instinctively reach for weapons. "Far Seeker, this is Eternal Resonance. Report your status immediately." "Commander Zalthek." "Sir, the border systems, they're gone. Vanished. Not destroyed, consumed. The Devourers have crossed into this sector 3 days ahead of all projections. They're already past the outer colonies." The channel filled with the sound of tearing metal and alien screams. Then silence. Zalsek stared at the communication panel, his crystalline form rigid with shock. When he looked up at Admiral Cross, his compound eyes reflected a terror older than human civilization. Outside the observation port, the stars continued their eternal dance, but now they danced over a galaxy at war. The Devourer fleet emerged from hyperspace, like a plague of metallic locusts, their forms blotting out entire starfields as they swept through the outer colonies. Each ship was a geometrical impossibility, crystalline structures that folded space around themselves, powered by engines that consumed matter at the quantum level and left nothing but emptiness in their wake. Admiral Cross stood in the command center of Proxima Station, watching long-range sensor readings with growing horror. The outer settlements of New Tasmania, Meridian Point and Haven's Rest had simply vanished. No debris fields, no radiation signatures, just empty space where millions of humans had lived and worked and dreamed of tomorrow. "How long until they reach the inner system?" she asked. Lieutenant Commander Parks, the station's tactical officer, consulted his displays with hands that trembled only slightly. "At current velocity, 18 hours to the asteroid mining facilities. 26 hours to Proxima Colony itself. 26 hours. In slightly more than a day, the Devourers would arrive at humanity's newest world, home to 12 million civilians who had no means of evacuation and nowhere to run." The blast doors at the rear of the command center hissed open, and Commander Zalthek entered accompanied by a small retinue of alien officers. His crystalline form moved with purpose, and his newly grafted arm held a datapad containing schematics that would have been incomprehensible to human science mere days ago. "Admiral," he said without preamble, "we have approximately 24 hours to transform this system's defenses from a minor inconvenience into something capable of stopping the oldest enemy in the galaxy." Cross turned from the tactical display. "The consortium fleet, 16 vessels remain operational. My fellow commanders have agreed to delay their departure pending resolution of the current crisis." The way he said it suggested that the agreement had involved some forceful persuasion. "We can provide technological upgrades to your defensive platforms and shield generators, but hardware alone will not be sufficient." "What do you need?" Zalthek activated his datapad, projecting a holographic display that showed the inner system's defensive layout. "The Devourers do not fight as we do. They do not seek conquest or territory. They seek consumption. Every atom of matter they encounter becomes fuel for their expansion. Conventional weapons are useless against them." The hologram shifted, showing recorded footage from previous Devourer encounters. Cross watched in fascination and horror as sleek alien warships fired devastating energy blasts that simply disappeared into the crystalline hulls of the enemy vessels, absorbed and converted into additional power. "However," Zalthak continued, "there is one force in the galaxy that they have never successfully adapted to." "Which is?" "Chaos. Pure, unpredictable, biological chaos." His compound eyes fixed on Cross with unmistakable intensity. "The Devourers are machines, Admiral, ancient and sophisticated beyond comprehension, but ultimately predictable in their patterns. They excel at countering organized technological responses because such responses follow logical parameters." Cross began to understand. But humans don't fight logically. Precisely. Your species' combat doctrine appears to be based on controlled insanity. You throw yourselves at impossible odds. You adapt faster than your enemies can counter-adapt, and you grow stronger under pressure rather than weaker. In the depths of Proxima Station, Cadet Lieutenant Jake Morrison stood before an assembly of his fellow cadets in Armory Bay 7. They had been released from academic suspension and pressed into emergency service as the gravity of the situation became clear. Around them, alien technicians worked frantically to integrate consortium weapons systems with human-manufactured equipment. The results were unorthodox. Morrison hefted a rifle that had been human-made that morning and was now something altogether different. The basic frame remained recognizable, but alien crystal matrices had been grafted onto the barrel, and the power cells hummed with energies that made his teeth ache. According to the technical specifications, it could punch through ship armor at a range of 3 kilometers. "Listen up," he addressed his fellow cadets, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had stared death in the face and lived to tell about it. "In about 24 hours, this system is going to be crawling with things that want to eat us. Not kill us, eat us. Convert every atom in our bodies into fuel for their expansion." The cadets listened with the focused intensity of youth confronting its own mortality. They were children of the frontier, born on worlds where weakness meant death, but nothing in their experience had prepared them for an enemy that sought not merely their defeat, but their complete eradication from existence. "The aliens think we're crazy," Morrison continued, gesturing toward the consortium technicians who were installing targeting systems that interfaced directly with human neural networks. "They think we fight without logic or reason. Maybe but that insanity is the only thing standing between the Devourers and everything we've ever cared about." Cadet Fleming, a slight woman from the ice world of Ragnarok, raised her hand. "Sir, what about evacuation? Surely the civilian—" "There is no evacuation," Morrison cut her off. "The Devourers move faster than our fastest ships. If we run, they'll catch us in open space where we have no cover and no support. Our only chance is to make our stand here in a system we know, with defenses we can control." He moved to the armory's observation port, gazing out at the bustling activity as human and alien crews worked together to prepare for the coming storm. In the distance, he could see the sleek forms of consortium warships taking up defensive positions around the system's critical infrastructure. "Besides," he added quietly, "even if we could evacuate everyone, where would we go? The Devourers have been expanding for millennia. Eventually, they would find us wherever we tried to hide." Cadet Rodriguez stepped forward. "So we make our stand here." "We make our stand here," Morrison confirmed. "And we show these ancient machines what happens when they threaten something humans care about." The preparations continued through the night, human ingenuity combining with alien technology in ways that defied both species' understanding of physics. Consortium shield generators were hardwired into human power grids, creating defensive barriers that drew energy from fusion reactors designed to power entire cities. Weapons platforms received targeting upgrades that allowed human gunners to track targets moving at significant fractions of light speed. But the most significant modifications were made to the humans themselves. In Medical Bay Alpha, Dr. Elizabeth Kane worked alongside hegemony biotechnicians to implement combat enhancements that would have been considered science fiction mere hours earlier. Reflex boosters that accelerated human nervous systems to superhuman speeds. Bone density augmentations that made already tough human skeletons nearly unbreakable. Sensory amplifiers that allowed human soldiers to perceive electromagnetic spectra invisible to unaugmented vision. "The changes are temporary," she explained to Admiral Cross, as they observed the enhancement procedures. "The human body can only sustain these modifications for a few hours at most. After that, the cellular damage becomes irreversible." Cross watched through observation windows as volunteers from every branch of the Colonial Defense Force underwent the procedures. Each one knew they were trading their long-term health for a few hours of superhuman capability. None of them hesitated. "How many can we enhance?" "Every human in the system, if necessary. The question is whether we should." Cross turned to face the doctor. "Explain." "These enhancements will turn your soldiers into something approximating the Devourer's own capabilities. Faster, stronger, more durable than baseline humans. But they'll also make them more aggressive, more willing to take risks, more likely to see violence as the solution to every problem." Sounds like exactly what we need. For the next 24 hours, yes. But what about afterward? What happens to a species when every member has experienced what it's like to be a living weapon? It was a question that would haunt humanity for generations to come. But first, they had to survive long enough to worry about the future. The Devourer fleet entered the outer system at 0347 hours, ship's time. They came not as conquerors but as a force of nature, inevitable, implacable, and utterly without mercy. The lead vessels were massive beyond comprehension, their crystalline hulls stretching for kilometers and pulsing with energies that warped space itself around them. Behind them came smaller craft, though smaller was relative when each one dwarfed the largest human battleship. The first engagement occurred at the asteroid mining facility of Ceres 7, where a skeleton crew of enhanced human miners had remained behind to operate the defensive platforms. The facility's weapons opened fire as soon as the Devourers entered range, sending streams of plasma and kinetic projectiles toward the approaching fleet. The energy blast struck the lead Devourer vessel and simply disappeared. Absorbed into the crystalline hull without so much as a scorch mark, the kinetic rounds fared no better. The alien ship's defensive fields caught the projectiles and fed them into matter converters that transformed solid metal into additional power for the fleet's engines. Chief Petty Officer Maria Santos, enhanced with hegemony reflex boosters and bone density augmentations, abandoned her position at the defensive controls and did something that defied every tactical manual ever written. She armed a mining charge, a device designed to crack asteroids, and launched herself toward the nearest Devourer vessel in an EVA suit. The mining charge detonated inside the Devourer's hull. For the first time in recorded history, a Devourer vessel staggered. The explosion, crude and primitive by galactic standards, had caught the ancient machine completely unprepared. Its matter converters couldn't process the chaotic energy release from a chemical explosive, and the blast tore through internal systems that hadn't been damaged in millennia. The ship didn't die, Devourers were too resilient for that, but it faltered, its perfect crystalline form marred by a ragged hole that leaked atmosphere and exotic energies into the vacuum of space. Aboard the Eternal Resonance, Commander Zoltek watched the tactical display with amazement that bordered on religious awe. "She actually heard it," he whispered. "One human with primitive explosives actually damaged a Devourer." "Is that significant?" Admiral Cross asked. "Admiral, the Devourers have been expanding across the galaxy for over 50,000 years. In all that time, no conventional weapon has ever penetrated their hulls. That human just accomplished something that entire civilizations have died trying to achieve." The victory was short-lived. The damaged Devourer vessel turned its attention to Ceres 7, and the asteroid facility simply ceased to exist, not destroyed but converted at the molecular level into additional mass for the alien fleet. Chief Santos and her crew died as they had lived, defiant to the end. But their sacrifice had proven something crucial. The Devourers could be hurt. The main fleet engagement began 6 hours later, as the Devourer force approached Proxima Colony's orbital defenses. The Human Consortium Alliance had arranged their ships in a defensive formation that would have been suicidal under normal circumstances. Multiple layers of vessels positioned so close together that their shield envelopes overlapped. Jake Morrison, now enhanced with every biological augmentation the Allied forces could provide, stood on the bridge of the assault ship Defiance. The modifications had transformed him into something that was still recognizably human but pushed to the absolute limits of what baseline biology could sustain. His reflexes operated in milliseconds. His muscles could generate forces measured in tons, and his enhanced vision could track targets moving at relativistic speeds. He was also slowly dying. The enhancements were burning through his cellular structure like acid, and he could feel his organs beginning to fail under the strain. The medical projections gave him perhaps 4 hours of combat effectiveness before his body simply shut down. It was exactly the kind of impossible situation that humans had been evolving to handle for millions of years. "All ships. This is Defiance," Morrison broadcast on the fleet channel. "Remember, we're not trying to win a traditional battle. We're trying to be so chaotic, so unpredictable, so absolutely insane that these ancient machines can't adapt fast enough to counter us." The Devourer fleet approached in perfect formation, their crystalline hulls gleaming with absorbed starlight. They moved with mechanical precision, each vessel maintaining exact distances from its neighbors. their courses calculated to optimize matter consumption efficiency. The Human Consortium Alliance charged them head-on in what appeared to be a completely suicidal frontal assault. The first wave consisted of modified mining vessels, ships designed to crack asteroids but now packed with every explosive device the Allied forces could manufacture. They accelerated toward the Devourer fleet at maximum burn, their human crews enhanced beyond the limits of biological possibility. The Devourers opened fire with energy weapons that could vaporize planets, but the mining ships were too small, too fast, and following flight paths that changed randomly every few seconds. Their enhanced human pilots pulled maneuvers that should have liquefied their organs, spinning and weaving through defensive fire with inhuman precision. 17 mining ships broke through the Devourer defensive perimeter. Each one detonated against an alien hull with the force of a small nuclear weapon. The explosions accomplished little damage individually, but they served a more important purpose. They disrupted the Devourer's perfect formation and forced the ancient machines to begin adapting their tactics. That was exactly what Morrison had been hoping for. Second wave, go, he commanded. The assault ships came next, military vessels enhanced with consortium shield generators and carrying crews of augmented humans armed with hybrid weapons that combined alien technology with human ingenuity. "Morrison, what are you doing?" Admiral Cross's voice crackled over the communication channel. "Something stupid," he replied, arming every weapon on his ship for simultaneous firing. "Tell my story." Defiance struck the Devourer command ship at nearly 10% of light speed. The impact should have been absorbed by the alien vessel's matter converters, but Morrison had done something that no sane pilot would ever attempt. He had synchronized his ship's weapon systems to fire at the exact moment of collision, creating a feedback loop that overloaded the Devourer's defensive systems with more energy than they could process. The explosion lit up half the system. When the light faded, the Devourer command ship was still there, but it was hurt. Badly hurt. A massive section of its crystalline hull had been torn away and internal fires burned with colors that didn't exist in normal space-time. More importantly, the rest of the Devourer fleet had paused. For the first time in their ancient existence, they were witnessing something that their programming couldn't immediately categorize. An enemy that seemed to grow more dangerous as it took losses, that treated certain destruction as a viable tactical option. Commander Zalthak seized the moment of confusion. "All consortium vessels, concentrate fire on the damaged command ship. Use every weapon you have." The Devourer command ship died hard, its death throes sending shock waves through dimensions that humans hadn't even discovered yet. As it finally collapsed into its component atoms, the rest of the Devourer fleet began to change. They had learned. The remaining Devourer vessels abandoned their perfect formations and began moving unpredictably, mimicking the chaos that had made the human attack so effective. They split into smaller groups, eliminated predictable firing patterns, and started targeting the most aggressive human pilots first. "They're adapting," Cross observed from Proxima Station's command center. "Learning from our tactics." "Yes," Zeltek agreed. "But they're learning to fight like us. And that means they're no longer fighting like themselves." In the end, it came down to numbers. The Human Consortium Alliance had perhaps 50 vessels of various sizes. The Devourers had begun the engagement with over 300. Despite losses that would have been considered catastrophic by any other enemy, they still had enough ships to complete their mission. The final Devourer assault on Proxima Colony began at 47 hours, as the surviving alien vessels closed on the planet itself. The orbital defenses, enhanced with consortium technology but manned by human crews, opened fire with every weapon they possessed. It wasn't enough. The Devourers began their consumption process, sending tendrils of crystalline energy down toward the planet's surface. Where those tendrils touched, matter simply ceased to exist, not destroyed but converted into fuel for the alien fleet's continued expansion. On the surface, 12 million human civilians watched their sky fill with alien fire and prepared to die as their species always had, fighting. That was when Jake Morrison, somehow still alive despite his body's systematic failure, made one final transmission from the wreckage of his ship. "All human vessels, all human personnel, all human civilians who can hear this, remember what we are. We are the species that conquered a death world. We are the children of the gravity well that forged us from iron and stubbornness. We are human, and we do not go gentle into that good night." His voice carried across every communication channel in the system, reaching enhanced soldiers dying in their cockpits, civilian militia preparing to make their last stand, and children huddled in evacuation shelters who would never live to see tomorrow. We rage against the dying of the light. The effect was immediate and impossible to quantify. Human forces that had been fighting at a 110% of their capabilities suddenly found reserves they didn't know they possessed. Civilian populations that should have been paralyzed with terror instead took up arms and prepared to sell their lives as dearly as possible. More importantly, something fundamental shifted in the Devourer's calculus. These ancient machines had consumed countless civilizations, and all of them had followed predictable patterns when faced with extinction. Despair, acceptance, final desperate attempts at survival or escape. Humanity did none of those things. As the Devourer consumption process began, humans became more dangerous, not less. They fought harder when cornered, innovated faster when desperate, and showed an absolute refusal to acknowledge the possibility of defeat even when facing inevitable destruction. The Devourers had learned to fight like chaos, but they had forgotten that chaos by definition couldn't be controlled or predicted, not even by those who wielded it. The turning point came when 12-year-old Emma Rodriguez, sheltering in an evacuation bunker on Proxima Colony's surface, made a discovery that would echo through galactic history. Her father had been one of the civilian volunteers who'd undergone combat enhancement, and he'd died in the first wave of orbital fighting. But before he died, he'd sent her a message, not words, but raw technical data on the consortium enhancement process. Emma, with the single-minded focus that only children possessed, spent the final hours of the siege studying that data and came to a conclusion that had escaped every adult mind working on the problem. The enhancements were temporary because adult human biology couldn't sustain them. But children's bodies were still growing, still adapting. The modifications that would kill an adult in hours might be sustainable in a younger, more flexible system. She began the enhancement process on herself. What happened next defied every law of biology and physics that both species understood. The 12-year-old girl, enhanced with technologies from a civilization millennia more advanced than her own, became something that was still recognizably human but pushed far beyond anything evolution had ever produced. She walked out of that bunker and began hunting devourers. Not ships, individual devourer entities that had descended to the planet's surface to oversee the consumption process. Ancient machine intelligences that had survived the deaths of galaxies found themselves stalked by a human child who could move faster than they could track and hit harder than their defensive systems could absorb. Emma Rodriguez, 12 years old and enhanced beyond the dreams of science fiction, became the deadliest individual combatant in the galaxy. Her example spread. Children across the colony, facing certain death anyway, began undergoing the enhancement process. Unlike the adults, their young bodies didn't burn out after a few hours. They adapted, evolved, became something new. The Devourers found themselves facing an enemy they had never encountered before. A species that could evolve in real time, that became more dangerous with each generation, that treated extinction as merely another obstacle to overcome. The ancient machines began to withdraw. It wasn't a retreat. Devourers didn't retreat. It was a strategic reassessment. For 50,000 years they had consumed civilizations by following predictable patterns of conquest and consumption. Humanity had broken those patterns so thoroughly that the machines' ancient programming couldn't process what they were encountering. As the Devourer fleet departed Proxima System, they left behind a galaxy forever changed. Humanity had survived first contact with the oldest enemy in known space, not through superior technology or brilliant tactics, but through sheer bloody-minded refusal to acknowledge the possibility of defeat. Commander Zilthek, his crystalline form bearing new scars from the battle, stood beside Admiral Cross in the ruins of Proxima Station's command center. Around them, human and alien crew members worked side by side to repair damage that would have been considered irreparable mere days earlier. "Your species has done something unprecedented," he said, his harmonic voice carrying undertones of awe. "You have forced the Devourers to retreat. In 50 millennia of expansion they have never withdrawn from a conquest." Cross nodded. watching through the observation ports as enhanced human children, impossibly young and impossibly dangerous, helped with repair operations that would have required industrial machinery under normal circumstances. "We bought ourselves time," she acknowledged. "But they'll be back, and when they return they'll have adapted to counter everything we used against them." "Yes, but by then you will have adapted as well." Shiltek's compound eyes reflected the lights of human ships moving between the stars. Ships now crewed by beings who were still recognizably human but had been forged into something new by the crucible of war. "The question is, what will humanity become while the Devourers are gone?" It was a question that would haunt philosophers and scientists for centuries to come. The enhancement process had been intended as a desperate last resort, a temporary modification to help humanity survive a single battle. Instead, it had become the foundation for the next stage of human evolution. Children like Emma Rodriguez, young enough to survive the enhancement process, old enough to understand its implications, would grow up to become something unprecedented in galactic history. They would be human in spirit and values, but possessed of capabilities that rivaled the ancient machines themselves. They would be the first generation of what historians would later call the ascended humans who had transcended the biological limitations of their species, while retaining the stubborn, chaotic, gloriously irrational spirit that had allowed their ancestors to conquer death worlds and challenge galactic empires. Jake Morrison, against all medical probability, survived his enhancements long enough to see the Devourer retreat. His body was failing, his organs shutting down one by one, but he lived long enough to witness what humanity had become in its darkest hour. As medical teams worked frantically to stabilize his condition, he gazed out at the stars and smiled. Somewhere out there, the Devourers were regrouping, adapting, preparing for their return. When they came back, they would be ready for everything humanity had shown them, but they wouldn't be ready for what humanity would become. The human species had been forged in the gravity wells of death worlds, tempered by millennia of warfare and survival, and now enhanced with technologies that pushed them beyond the boundaries of baseline biology. They had become something new, not quite human, not quite machine, but possessed of the best qualities of both. The Devourers had taught humanity a valuable lesson. In a universe full of ancient enemies and impossible odds, the only way to survive was to become impossible yourself. As Morrison's consciousness faded, his last thought was of Emma Rodriguez and the other enhanced children who would grow up in the world he had helped create. They would face challenges he could barely imagine, fight enemies he couldn't comprehend, and make choices that would determine the fate of not just humanity but every species in the galaxy. They would be warriors and scholars, protectors and explorers, the inheritors of a legacy written in blood and starlight. They would be human in all the ways that mattered. Curious, stubborn, compassionate, and absolutely, utterly unwilling to surrender in the face of impossible odds. They would be humanity's future. And that future, Morrison realized as the darkness claimed him, was going to be absolutely spectacular. The Proxima incident, as historians would later call it, marked the end of humanity's childhood and the beginning of its maturity as a galactic power. The species that had once been dismissed as primitive death warders had proven that evolution was still possible, that adaptation could happen in real time, and that the most dangerous force in the universe wasn't technology or ancient wisdom, but the willingness to change everything rather than accept defeat. The Devourers would return someday. That was inevitable. Ancient, patient, and impossibly vast. They would spend decades or centuries developing countermeasures to humanity's chaotic tactics. But when they came back, they would find that humanity hadn't been idle. They would find a species that had taken the harsh lessons of the Proxima battle and used them to forge something unprecedented in galactic history, a civilization that combined the technological sophistication of elder races with the biological adaptability that had allowed humans to conquer death worlds. They would find the Ascended. And in that final confrontation between ancient machines and evolved humanity, the galaxy would discover what happened when an unstoppable force met an immovable object that absolutely refused to be moved. The universe was about to become a far more interesting place.